How to Sew the Very Useful Bags by Amber Makes. Make this in 4 different prints that you can see here and stitch this very useful pair of bags. They're perfect for gifts and for storing everything you need inside. Cutting out. Take the panel that's in your kit and give it a good press. If you have a look at it, you can see all the pieces are already printed to shape and the seam allowances are included. Every piece has the label of what the name of the piece is above it. So cut it out along the outer lines, you don't need to add anything extra, and pin the label to the top of the right side so you remember which piece is which. All the cut out corners are already put in for you, and we've put in lots of little extra pieces that you can use for making or appliquing to your own makes. There's even labels for you to personalise your own bag as well. So cut around everything and don't forget to pin the label on top. You'll also need 2 zips, one for the small bag and one for the large bag. The measurements for these are given in your instructions. And some wadding. This is optional if you want to give your bag some extra padding. Once you've done that, it will all look like this. So here's all the pieces for the bags. You can see I've got the outer pieces, the lining pieces, and the pocket outer and the pocket lining. And a little zip tab to neaten your zip at the end. And all the pieces for the small bag, so I've got the outer pieces and the lining pieces. For the outer ones, I haven't cut the cut-out corners yet because I'm going to do that later when I add the wadding. But if you're not adding wadding, then cut around those corners now. And here are the 2 pocket pieces for the small bag and the zip tab as well. All of these labels you can use, you can write on them or embroider them to personalise your bag. And there's lots and lots of little pieces that you can use if you want to have them for your own makes. So now you've got everything cut out, we're all ready to start sewing. Adding wadding. This is optional if you want to give your bag some extra padding, but you don't need to do this. If you do, the quantity of wadding you need is listed in the instructions. So place the outer pieces, so the large bag front outer, the large bag back outer, small bag front outer and small bag back outer. Place them right sides up on top of the glue side of the wadding. Smooth them out and then press them into place following the manufacturer's instructions for your wadding. If you're not using a fusible wadding, then simply tack them into place all the way around the edge. And you can see I've left the cut-out corners uncut because I find it easier to press my wadding into place and then trim it afterwards. Once you've pressed it all into place, trim the wadding so it's level with the raw fabric edges all the way round. And it will look like this. So those are the 2 pieces for the bag, the large bag, and then the 2 small pieces for the small bag. So you can ready to start constructing both of your bags now. Making the pocket. Both bags are made in exactly the same way. I'm going to show you how to make the large bag here, and all you have to do is follow these instructions to make the small bag. So we'll start by making the pocket. So place the pocket outer and the pocket lining right sides facing, making sure the top edges of each are both at the top so the print faces the right way. And then matching raw edges, pin it together all the way round. So I pin it together across the top and then I'll pin it together down the sides. Make sure that the corners match up. Pin it together at the corner and then pin it together between, and then you can ease it all to fit. Now you need to leave a turning gap in the bottom edge for turning the pocket right sides out. If you're making the large pocket, which I am here, then fold it in half just to find the centre. You can just use that little crease, and we need to leave a 3-inch gap for turning. So measure and mark 1.5 inches either side of this. If you're making the small bag, then for the small pocket, you need to leave a 2-inch turning gap. These measurements are all listed in the instructions though, so you don't need to remember this. And then sew it together all the way around, starting on one side of the turning gap and finishing on the other. This is the small pocket, just so I can show you. So when you're making the small pocket, you need to leave a 2-inch turning gap. So don't forget that they're different sizes, you need the smallest gap possible for turning out. Once you've sewn it together, press the seam over to one side. This just helps it to lay on the edge. And then snip off the corners. Just make sure you don't cut through the seam allowance, but snipping off the corners does help to reduce bulk and you'll get neater right-angled points. But if you press all those seams over to one side, it'll help those seams to lay on the edge. Once that's done, turn the pocket right sides out through the turning gap. I find it helps that before you do this, if you press both sides of the turning gap over to the wrong side, then when you come to sew it close later, they're just folded to the inside. So do that just before you turn it right sides out. If you don't remember, it doesn't matter. You can do that at the end. And now turn it right sides out by just pushing your fingers into all of the corners so it goes all the way through the turning gap. Because we need quite a small turning gap so it's easier to close, but obviously for the bigger bag you need a bigger one, the bigger pocket you need a bigger one, just so that you can get all the fabric through the gap, which is why they're different sizes for the small one and the large one. So poke your fingers into all the corners, turn it right sides out, and then use something like a turning tool. I'm using the stick that comes with my loop turner just to turn that out, but just anything that's not too sharp but a little bit pointed. Then roll the seams between your fingers so they lay on the edge. Having pressed the seam allowance over to one side really helps with this, and then press them all the way around. You'll get a much neater pocket if you take the time to make sure those seams lay on the edge. So the aim here is that the seam is on the edge but you can't see any of the lining. Fold the turning gap back underneath if it's come undone while you were turning it right sides out. And then once you're happy it's all pressed, top stitch along the top edge. That just neatens it, but also holds the lining to the inside, and then it will look like this. Now to attach the pocket you're going to put it on the back lining, you need to position it 1.5 inches down from the top edge. So I find you can measure this with just a tape measure. If you've got a ruler, then I like to just draw a line. It doesn't need to go all the way along, but just draw a line, and then that's where the top of your pocket's going to be, 1.5 inches from the top. Now, I'm just double checking that, just to show you it's 1.5 inches. Now, to make sure the pocket is positioned correctly, fold the back lining in half and just mark that crease. It just needs to be finger pressed because it's just a centre mark. And then take your pocket and fold that in half to make a centre crease. It's just a quicker way of placing it centrally rather than measuring. Then make sure the top of the pocket is along that 1.5 inch line, and also that the centre marks match up. And now your pocket is centrally placed 1.5 inches down from the top. And once you're happy it's in the right place, pin it into place all the way round and then top stitch it. And once you've done that, it looks like this. So I've stitched it down the side, across the bottom and up the other side. Now you can add a little popper or press fastener or snap to hold that pocket closed, or like I've done with the Just for Men one, I sewed a vertical line down the centre because I thought I'd keep bottles in here. So it's up to you. You can put a little popper or draw down. You don't have to put anything, but I just find it helps to hold it closed. Inserting the zip on the front. So take the bag front outer and the longer zip. The zip is longer than you need because we'll trim it later. Now start by measuring and marking 3/4 inch from the left hand side on the top of the bag front outer. You'll notice the top because it hasn't got the cutout corners. Take your zip and undo it, and then place it right sides down on top. Now take the end of the zip tab where the metal or plastic end is and fold it up like this. So it's at a right angle and so that the fold is on the top. So you can see here it's folded up so that where that metal end is. Now the metal end, which is the end of the zip teeth, needs to go on that mark. Just like that. So if you're using a continuous zip, just fold it up and just make sure the edge of the fold goes on there. But if you're using a closed end zip that has a metal or plastic end, fold it up there. Now the zip tape needs to run level with the raw top edge of the bag front outer. So pin it into place all the way along. As you do this, just adjust it to make sure that the edge of the zip tape runs along with the bag front outer. And don't forget, your zip is right sides facing. I find it's easier to do this if the zip is open. And then pin it into place all the way along to the end. Once you've done that, you now need to mark on the zip tape. So take your tape measure and make a mark 1 inch from the edge of the bag on the zip tape, and I'm just going to pop a pin there. So just 1 inch from the end. Now tack this into the place using the longest stitch on your machine from the left hand side, but stop exactly at that pin mark. And then it will look like this. You can see I've tacked it really close within the seam allowance, so only about 1/8 of an inch from the edge. Now take the lining. So this is the bag front lining. You can take the label off now. Make sure you've got the top edge, so those cut out corners at the bottom, and place that right sides down on top. Match up the top and pin into place, and make sure that those side raw edges are matching as well. I like to place a horizontal pin here, just holds it into place. And then do the same at the end, at the other end. Make sure the zip is just inside, and then pin it together, making sure those side raw edges and the top raw edges meet up. And then put another pin on the side, and that just keeps everything steady. Now you can pin it into place all the way along, because you know that the tops and the sides all match up. The two fabric pieces are the same, but because you may have added wadding to the front outer, sometimes that can pull the fabric in slightly. So if you make sure that the side edges are the same, then you can just pull the fabric slightly so that the two pieces match up. The zip is now sandwiched between the front outer and the front lining, and the raw edges of the zip tape and the front and the back all match up. So now it's pinned together all the way along. We need to make another couple of marks. So take your tape measure and make a mark on the lining 1 inch in from the right hand side. Just place a vertical mark there, and then another one 1/4 of an inch away from that. So that's 3/4 of an inch from the end. So 3/4 of an inch and 1 inch, so you've got 2 marks. Now using a zip foot and 1/4 inch seam allowance, sew all the way along and stop exactly on that first mark. Reverse stitch or use a lock stitch on your machine, just showing you with the pin there. So this is where you stop stitching. I've stitched all the way along, and that little flap is left unstitched. Now what we need to do is pull the zip downwards out of the way, and then pin the lining back into place. And this is what will give you your open top zip and allow it to open fully. Pin it into place at the side, and this zip mustn't get caught in the next seam. So I like to pull it right down and pop a pin just along there just to make sure. Now start stitching from the second mark and finish at the end, reverse stitching either end. So you're going to leave a 1/4 of an inch gap unstitched. So you can see there's the 1/4 of an inch unstitched, and if I show you here, the zip is now hanging loose and not caught in that seam. Now refold it so it's wrong size facing. So there's the lining, there's the outer. I'm going to just give it a little press before I put the next side of the zip on. So with that, pull the lining down and press it so that the seam at the end is laying right on the edge, and then press the lining as well, making sure you pull it right down so it's got no creases or puckers. It just makes it easier when you top stitch it later if you pull it downwards. And then do the same with the front. If you match up those bottom corners, you can make sure it's pulled. So press there, and then make sure that that front outer is laying nice and flat with the seam right on the edge. And I like to give this seam at the end a little press as well, and that just holds everything nicely in place. And now you've finished inserting the zip on the front, we're ready to insert the zip on the back in the next stage. Inserting the zip on the back. We do this in 2 stages to just make it easier. So here's the back lining. We're going to do this the same way, but just the opposite way around. So take your back lining and place it right sides up, and just mark 3/4 of an inch in from the left hand side. Now take your front and back, the front lining and outer that's got the zip attached, and undo the zip all the way around, all the way along. The zip now will be right sides up on the back lining. So fold the zip again, just like you did last time, but this time fold it at that metal end so it's underneath. The last time you did it, it was on top. This time you fold it so it's underneath. It just makes a neater finish to do it this way, and pin it into place. So make sure it's underneath and it's right sides up. Now line up the front and the back, front out and the back lining down the side edges. I'm just going to do the zip up because this just helps to make sure everything's straight just at this stage. Make sure the side is matched up and the top of the zip tape and the bag lining are matched up. And pin it together at the side and pin it together at the top. Now that 3/4 of an inch mark you made, that will be where the end of the metal end is. So you can just make sure it's in the right place, but actually it's more important that the sides match up. And then pin it into place. And then go to the other end and make sure the sides of the outer and the lining, make sure all of that matches up and pin them into place. This just keeps everything steady. And then pin the zip tape to the top of the back lining. I had to move that down a bit, so I'm just going to adjust that pin. And then you can pin all the way along. So although this seems odd that you're working the other way around, it's just that the best way to get this fully open top zip is to work one way to do the front and one way to do the other side of the zip. If you just follow this, it does work, but you just have to do it this way up because you want to be starting from the same end of the zip each time. Now before you start stitching, we've got to make that 1 inch mark again. So just measure, I'm just going to put a pin where the end of the lining is so I can see it. Measure 1 inch to the left of the end of the lining and just put a pin in there. So it's the same process as that we used before. Now tack it into place using the longest stitch on your machine from one end all the way along and stop exactly on that pin within the seam allowance. You can see here, now I've got the zip attached to the back lining and I stop stitching 1 inch from the end. You can keep the zip unzipped now. Now take the back lining, the back outer. You've got the back lining, the back outer. Place the back outer right sides facing with the back lining. Match up the top and the side edges. So this is exactly the same. Once you've done it once, the only difference is the turning the zip under, but the whole process is the same. And then pin it together at the other end. Make sure that the top and the side raw edges match up. Obviously, we'll take those pins out in a moment, but for just pinning it into place, it just helps to get everything matching up. And then pin the back outer to the zip all the way around. So now the zip is sandwiched between the back outer and the back lining, and the zip is right sides up. So just like the front, the zip and the back outer and the outer are right sides facing. You can double check with the instructions. All of this is listed in words. If you want to double check outers and linings, it's all written in there. Once it's pinned all the way along the top, we need to make those marks again. So you can see everything's matching up. So take your tape measure and then mark 1 inch in from the right hand side. If you're marking on the top of the wadding, you'll have to do it a few times so that it can be seen. And then another mark 1/4 of an inch to the right of that. So you've got that 2 marks, 1/4 inch between. Now sew that into place using your zip foot, just like before, and stop on that first mark. So you can see here, I've stitched it all into place. I can remove these pins now, and I stop stitching and reverse stitched. Now pull the zip down just like you did before, and then repin the lining and the outer together. Make sure the side raw edges are matching up. It's only a little seam, but this is what helps your bag to open completely. Pull the zip right down because it mustn't get caught in this second seam. And if you want to, you can just pop a pin in just to hold the zip into place and then start stitching on the second mark and work to the end. And don't forget to lock stitch or reverse stitch at either end of this seam. Now once that's done, it will look like this. So we've got the zip attached to the front outer and front lining and the back outer and the back lining. We're just going to give it a press like give the back outer a press like we did with the back lining, like we did with the front. because you won't be top stitching just yet, but it does make it a lot easier if you take the time to press it while it's all nice and flat once you've joined the bag together. Because if you're putting in a normal zip that's not an open wide one like this, then you would top stitch at this stage, but because we're doing this different sort of zip insertion, then you top stitch it at the end, so it's just easier to press everything flat now. So always pull the lining down, pull the outer down. That then moves the seam to make sure it's right on the edge. And then give it a press. And that's the zip fully inserted, nice and neatly between the outers and the linings. Assembling the bag. Now you've put your zip in, open it up halfway so the slide is in the centre of the two bags, the two pieces. Take the two outer pieces and place them right sides facing, and the two lining pieces and place them right sides facing. Now we need to pin together these two seams that are at the end of the zips. If you've have one seam facing one way and one the other, they will nest together better. Push a pin through the top seam and then make sure the pin comes out exactly into the bottom seam, and then you can be sure they're matched up exactly. So if you do that a little bit of the way down from the top and then right close to the top, that makes sure the seam matches up exactly. As I say, make sure that one seam faces one way and one the other, and then they lay flatter. You haven't got too much bulk. You can then remove those placement pins once you've pushed the pins across. Turn it round to the other side and making sure that you've got the seams facing the same, the top seam facing one way, the top seam facing the other way, but make sure they're not twisted in the centre. So just have a look at the other end just to make sure that they're facing the same way. Push a pin about 1/2 inch from the top through the top seam and then push that pin into the bottom. That's why I'm doing this on my ironing board, because then I can push the pins in. And then just a little bit down from the top, through the top seam, through the bottom seam. I find that doing these two placement pins really helps to keep those seams matching up. And then push a pin through all the layers, so it's either side of the pin. And then you know the seams match up and you can remove those placement pins. Once you've done that, that's the most important part. Those seams now match up. Now you can pin the outers together. So I'm starting at the end of that cutout corner. They're exactly the same size, so they'll match nicely. And then pin the bottom of the outers together, because we're not going to sew around the cutout corners. We're only going to sew along the side edges. So as always, pin it together at either end to make sure that the side and the top raw edges match up. And then pin it together all the way along. Obviously, if you've added wadding like I have, then you've got quite a few layers to get through. But you can still see, I like to sort of angle it forward just to make sure that the fabric raw edges are matching up. That's why I'm putting vertical pins in, because of all the layers. I find it holds them better and more securely in place. So once you've pinned along the bottom edge, you can then pin the outers together. Again, match up the bottom corner first. I'm just going to anchor that into my ironing board. That holds it into place, and then you can pin between, and then you can put the final one. I just find that when you're pinning two layers of fabric, particularly if they've got wadding, if you anchor one end into your board, then you can pull the other end to make sure that they match up exactly. So now you've got all the outers pinned together, you can pin the lining sections together. This is a bit easier because there isn't any wadding. You don't have to add wadding. It all depends on the look you want. If you want to have two bags that can fold up nicely, if you want to keep them stored away and you don't want all the padding, then don't. But if you're going to be putting things in that need to be protected, then the padding really helps. And it also gives them a nicer finish. So that's the linings pinned together down one side. I'm now going to pin them down the other side. Just get the end of the zip, you'll see it at whichever end you're working, and just make sure that's folded to the inside. Otherwise, you'll end up getting it caught in the seam because it's quite close to the seam. It's only 3/4 inch away from that seam. So if you make sure that it's folding downwards, you'll soon know if you sew over it, but if you keep it out of the way, then that won't happen. Now we need to leave a turning gap in the bottom of the lining for turning the whole bag right sides out. So if you're making the large bag, you'll need to leave a turning gap of 3 inches, just the same as with the pocket. So measure and mark the halfway point, and then if you're making the large bag, measure and mark 1.5 inches either side of that, and then that leaves a 3-inch gap centrally in the bottom edge. And then you can pin it together. And that 3 inches is just enough so that you can turn the bag right sides out when you've finished, but you don't want it too big, otherwise it leaves too much of a gap that you've then got to sew closed, and you don't get as neat a finish. So although I'm going to leave that turning gap unstitched, I still like to pin it together because it just holds that edge still. Now you can sew it together. So sew it together all the way around. Don't sew the turning gap and don't sew round the cutout corner. So down one side, across the bottom, up the other side, all the way along, but leave the cutout corners unstitched. And here's the small bag, just to show you that with this one, I've pinned that one already, but with this one, there's a 2-inch turning gap. Don't forget that they're different sizes. Other than that, other than those 2 gap differences, the bags are made in exactly the same way. So once you've stitched it, I've just done that, fold the edges of the turning gap over to the wrong side. It just makes it easier to pin and sew it together later if you've actually pressed them over. You're just pressing them over by 1/4 inch so they match up with the 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then press all of the seams over to one side. You can't press them open because of the shape of the bag, but if you press them over to one side like this, then they will lay on the edge more easily when you turn it right sides out. With the wadding, if you've got wadding in your bag, then just press this gently or use a pressing cloth so you don't catch the wadding and melt it on your iron. I find it if you just press it just quickly and just try and keep the iron off the wadding, then it's fine. So now that's your bag fully assembled, all sewn together. So the next thing we're going to do is box the corners. Boxing the corners, and this is what gives the shape to your bag. So on the outer, take the one cutout corner and open it up like this, and then rearrange it so the side seam and the base seam sit exactly on top of each other. So you just open it up and then place one seam so it's exactly on the other. If you want to make sure that this seam matches up exactly, push a pin through the seam on the top, pull it apart a little bit and make sure that pin comes out right into the seam beneath. And do that about 1 inch down and then a little bit way up from the top. Particularly if you're using wadding, this just helps to make sure the seams match up. Once you've got your placement pins like that, then place a pin through all layers either side of the placement pin, and then you can remove it. With the outer corners, I think it's worth doing to make sure they line up exactly. It just gives you a neat finish. Not so important with the lining, but I do this with the outer. And then open up the corner. Now to make sure the fabric is lying exactly flat without any creases inside, if you run, I'm using a turning tool stick here, but you can use just something like the end of some scissors and then pin it together. It's just sometimes the fabric inside, particularly with the wadding, can have a little crease or tuck. But if you take a stick like this and run it into the corner, that just makes sure that the fabric's sitting right in the corner, and then pin together. Make sure those raw edges match up. So you've got sort of a triangle shape now. Sew that together all the way along. And then repeat that with the other outer corner. Repeat it with one lining corner. Again, match the seams. I'm just going to do that by rolling one seam on top of the other, only because it's easier to do with the lining, and also it doesn't matter so much if they're not a perfect match because they'll be inside. And because there isn't any wadding, it's easier to make sure this lays flat, and then you can give that a press. Obviously, if you haven't put any wadding in your outer, then I would give it a press to make sure that it stays. With the wadding, I wouldn't press it. And then pin together. All the way along the corner. And then you can sew that one, and then repeat that with the final lining corner. Open it up, match the seams, and sew it all together. And then once you've done that, it looks like that. So now I've boxed both outer corners and both lining corners. So now you can turn it right sides out, but I'm going to show you something here that helps to keep the lining on the inside. So take the lining corner and the outer corner, follow the seam along with your finger, and then fold them together like this, so the seam's on the inside. And then pin them together, matching that centre seam and the edges, because they're exactly the same size. This method will hold the lining inside the bag, so it means the lining doesn't get pulled to the outside, and it also gives the bag more structure. You don't have to do this, and it's entirely up to you, but it will just helps to keep the lining inside and makes your bag look a bit more professional as well. So once you've matched up the edges, pin them together across the top, and then to keep everything nice and flat, I'm also going to pin it across the side as well. So pin them together down the side, that keeps it flat. Now, sew these two corners together, but within the seam allowance, so just 1/8 of an inch from the edge, because you don't want these stitches to show at all. When you've done them, it looks like this. So you can see I've just sewn just 1/8 of an inch from the edge, so you can see how the lining and the outer is joined. And then repeat that on the other side. Take the other outer corner and the lining corner, open them out like this, follow the seam with your finger to make sure it's not twisted, push it downwards, and then match up the corners. As long as you open them up so that you can make sure that you've followed one to the other and it won't get twisted, then this will work. Roll one seam on top of the other, because they don't need to match perfectly. You don't need placement pins, but the seams do need to sit on top of each other so that the lining sits nicely in the bag. And you will notice if you do use this method, that it does look a lot neater inside. So again, make sure the raw edges are matching up, pin it together at the top, and then pin it on the sides as well. So you'll have to just rearrange everything. Although this seam allowance is sewn within the seam allowance, this seam is sewn within the seam allowance, it still helps to keep things flat. So pop it under the machine and sew all those layers together just inside that seam. And then it will look like this, and you've got sort of a pasty shape, so it's all attached. The linings and outers attached either side. And now everything is attached neatly into place, and we can move on next to finishing the bag. Finishing the bag. So now you've joined it all together and sewn the box corners, we need to turn it right sides out. So the turning gap that you've left in the lining, just push the whole bag through that. You'll need to do this slowly and carefully and just ease it through. And obviously if you've got wadding in there, it will take a little bit longer, but the gap is big enough. But just don't do it quickly and don't pull it, otherwise you might split the seam. If you do, it doesn't matter, you can always sew it closed again. But just try to do it slowly and carefully, and it will go through. So now push the whole thing through, and then open up the zip. If you turn the whole bag right sides out, that makes it a bit easier. So push the zip tape through as well. The zip tape might be through, it just depends how you've left it. But the zip needs to come out through there, and then open up the whole zip, it just makes it easier. So you can see now how the lining is attached to the outer. You can't see any of the stitches, but it's nice and neat. But check that those corners are all neat and you haven't stitched in any little tucks or creases, because you can go back and change that if you have. But if everything's nice and neat, then take the edges of that turning gap, fold them back under. You may need to press them, because when you've turned the bag right sides out, you can see that it pulls them all out a bit. So you might find it easier to just repress them so they're nice and flat. I've got the ends of my seam there. Actually, this is a little bit wrinkled, so I'm going to press it because it is going to make it easier, because it does get a bit wrinkled. It's better that I actually pressed it under earlier, but it does get a bit wrinkled. So just take the time to press them if it is. And it's just easier to sew it closed if it's nice and flat. And then match up the turned under edges and pin them together. Now you can top stitch this gap closed by machine, which is what I'm going to do, or you can slip stitch it closed. If you slip stitch it by hand, it will be flatter. If you top stitch, it will just be more secure. It's entirely up to you. For mine, I've top stitched it, but it doesn't really matter. And then just give it a press to just iron out any wrinkles on the inside. And that's the gap finished. Now I'm just going to press the seam again, just from the inside. And although I did that after I'd inserted the zip, with all the sewing and the turning out and turning in, sometimes things can shift a bit. So just go all around the inside of the lining and just make sure that that lining is still facing downwards, and remove any little creases because we're going to do some top stitching in a minute. And you do this on the lining, then turn it right sides out. And push your corners out again. And then press it from the right side. There will be some creases because of the turning right sides out. So just the flatter this is, the neater you finish. And the seam that's between the end of the zips, just make sure you've got more bulk here. So that does need an extra press just to make sure the seam actually lies right on the edge, because you don't want any of the lining showing from the outside. So do take the time here. If you find that there's a lot of bulk in that seam, if you just give it a quick spray with water and then press it, that will help to make it lay flat. Now once it's pressed all the way along, you can top stitch all the way around the top edge. I did mine about 1/4 of an inch from the top. Make sure you don't sew into the ends of the zip. And that neatens the edge and also holds the lining inside. And then it will look like this. So you can see that top stitch all the way around the edge. It holds the lining to the inside and also gives a nice neat finish around the top of your bag. So to just make sure everything looks nice and neat, roll those box corner seams between your fingers and just press them. And again, a little spray of water will help with this. Roll them between your fingers and press them. This is what will give your bag a little bit more structure and help it to stand up nicely. And then if you take one corner on one side and one on the other, just pinch the corners and then make sure that the front outer between the two corners is in a straight line and press. And that crease gives a nice bottom. Do that to the other side. So take one corner, take the other corner. If you just pull them, you'll have a straight edge between them. The bags have been designed so the design will sit exactly within this as well. And then you can see you've got a nice straight flat bottom to the bag and will help it to sit up a bit better. So take the time to do that pressing. Now all we've got to do left is finish off the end of the zip. Adding the zip tab. So take the zip tab. There's a different one for the small bag and different for the long bag. And turn the top edge, so that's the long edge that's got the, if you made sure that you put the label along the top, it's the top long edge. And you need to turn it over by 1/4 of an inch. So if you measure, I'm doing this on the wrong side, a 1/2 an inch down from the top, and just push pins in where you can mark it. And if you fold the edge so it meets up with those marks, if you've got pins, you can just move the pins and pop them back in. Then you've turned it over exactly a 1/4 of an inch. Press that just to hold it in place. And once you've turned and pressed it over by 1/4 of an inch, then you need to fold it in half. So you've got the short ends matching. Make sure that those folded over ends stay folded over by putting a pin into them and then just pin it at the other end. And then sew it together along that short end. And then it will look like this. So you've got like a little tube. Open up your tube by just putting your finger inside. And then open up that seam. I'm just going to open up with my fingers for now. And the seam needs to lay in the centre. So make sure it lays on the back of the centre. But you will have probably made a crease as you were pressing it earlier. So that seam needs to lay in the centre and give it a press, and the folded over edges stay folded over. And then pin at the other end, so that's the only raw edges that are left, and sew it together. So now you've got like a little square that's sewn at the ends. Trim off those corners, take care not to cut the seam. And I also like to trim a little bit off those top edges, it just reduces the bulk inside. And it will look like this. And now you need to just turn it right sides out. It's only a little pocket, so you can just do this with your fingers. So just push your fingers inside and then use something, I'm using the turning tool stick here, but use something that's not sharp but got a little bit of point. Gently push out the corners so you don't split the stitches or the fabric. Just gently, so you've got nice little right angles. Make sure that that edge is folded under, and then give it a press, and you've made a little pocket that you're going to put in the end of your zip in. It neatens it, and it's got a little illustrated decoration on it to match your bag as well. So that's your zip tab finished. Now take your bag, so here's the large bag, and close the zip. This is really important, or you'll cut off the zip tab. Close the zip. Now you can see the zip is longer than you need because it's easier for insertion. Measure 2 inches along the zip, so from the right hand side of the bag along the zip tape, measure 2 inches, and just pop a pin in there so you know that's your 2 inches. And double check again, make sure your zip's closed. I've done it before where I've forgotten to close the zip and then cut off the zip tab. Then trim the zip along that, so the zip is now 2 inches longer than the actual bag, and you need this so you can open it wide. Now I like to just trim off the corners of that, it just helps it to sit in the zip tab better. So there's the end of your zip. Take your little zip tab pocket, just pop your finger inside to open it up a little bit and push the end of the zip inside. That encloses the end of the zip, so the zip tab won't come, the slider won't come off. Adds a bit of decoration, and because it has a little illustration that matches the bag, it looks really nice too. So pin that into place, make sure the end of the zip tape is right inside, and then put a couple of pins in through all the way through to the back of the zip tab. Now top stitch in the square all the way round, and then it will look like this. So the end of your zip is neatly inside the zip tab, and you've now finished your large bag. It's open wide so you can get loads inside. You've got your pocket there with your popper or your sewn bit to keep all your bits and pieces in. And a nice flat bottom as well. And these bags make lovely gifts for people as well. And the small bag you can use for smaller items. It made in exactly the same way. It's got a little pocket. I put a popper on that one, but that's up to you. And I put wadding on both of mine. But there's your beautiful set of very useful bags all ready. You just have to decide which set that you're going to make.